The year is 532 AD, and the Roman Emperor, the moody-faced Justinian I, is in the 6th year of his reign. He doesn't quite know it yet, or perhaps he thinks he does, but he will go on to have one of the most important reigns in Roman history, reshaping the Mediterranean world for years to come, for better or for worse. And of course, these are the exploits he's most famous for. His, or rather his generals', great defence against the might of Sassanid Persia, his conquests in North Africa and the Italian peninsula, which makes it all the more amusing when you consider such exploits may have never come to fruition. Justinian may have lost his diadem, if not his life, much earlier. By the early 530s, the people had had enough of Justinian, as we'll get into. By their thousands, the people of Constantinople rose up. From the smouldering fumes of torched churches, great change was in the air. But first, some well-needed context. In ancient Rome, there were 4 chariot racing factions that competed at the Great Games at the Hippodrome. First, the Circus Maximus in Rome, and later the Constantinopolitan Hippodrome. These teams were the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, and the Whites. And also, very briefly, if at all, during the reign of Domitian, the Purples and the Golds. Though, like Domitian himself, they never really caught on. But for the purposes of the Nika Riots, only 2 of these dominant factions are important. The Blues and the Greens, who by this point were far more than mere sports teams. And I emphasise this because the Nika Riots and their perpetrators, the Blues and the Greens, are often misrepresented, sometimes equated to modern sports hooliganism, which, as I view it, is wholly inaccurate. This is not a case of Barrius 63 devastated because his beloved team performed poorly. This was, as it turned out, a full-on coup d'etat, as politicised as you could get. While the quote-unquote sports teams of the Hippodrome began as just that, by the reign of Justinian they had grown into immense social and political forces, with their toes in everything from the city's entertainment to high politics. Yet, thankfully for the emperor, the 2 factions were almost always divided, and by extension, docile. Never much of a threat to his own reign by virtue of the fact they were always at each other's necks, rather than his. But on the 13th of January 532 AD, that had changed completely. In a shocking turn of events, the Blues and the Greens had united as one, taking Emperor Justinian completely off guard. All of a sudden, the traditional flow of hatred had been completely turned on its head, now directed towards Justinian himself. And as a part of this new anti-Justinian coalition, they gave themselves a unique watchword, a simple word with an effective message. Nika, that is, conquer, or victory in Greek. But why did this happen? Why, seemingly out of the blue, or blues I should say, and greens, did the 2 old enemies unite against a new common enemy in the Roman Emperor? Well, let's first get into why Justinian was so hideously unpopular in the early years of his reign. First of all, everyone's favourite subject, taxes. Even this early into his reign, Justinian couldn't help but wave his wallet around, and thus his grand expenditures needed to be paid, which, as is so often, fell on the common people by way of taxation. Such expenditures included the costly war with Sassanid Persia, which had only recently been wrapped up, the subsequent so-called eternal peace, okay, sure, that followed, which included an annual gold tribute to the Persian Shahanshah, Khusro I, and also the financing of expensive construction works, such as those in Constantinople itself, including the mighty church of Saints Sergius and Bacchus, which still stands proud in Istanbul today. And as such expenditures piled up, taxes rose significantly, while Justinian remained in the safety of his grand palace, affecting Constantinople's rich and poor alike, in effect, sowing the seeds of popular discontent not just among both sides of the political spectrum, but the socio-economic spectrum too. Yet beyond Justinian's economic policies in isolation, the men appointed to facilitate them were, if possible, even more unpopular. that being Justinian's praetorian prefect, John the Cappadocian, and his quaestor, Tribonian. John in particular had an appalling reputation. Procopius describes him as follows. He was, quote, the most based of all men. Wait, that can't be it. The basest of all men, who neither considered for God nor any shame before man entered into his mind, but to destroy the lives of many men for the sake of gain, and to wreck whole cities was his constant concern. How much of this talk is slander is hard to say, at least some of it probably is, though not that it matters. The fact still remains that by the beginning of 532 AD, John was the most hated man in the empire, according to John Julius Norwich. Yeah, no kidding. And while Tribonian's reputation for moral decadence was not nearly as bad as John's, he was, strike one, allegedly an unashamed pagan, and, strike two, deeply materialistic and avaricious, not unlike John. Therefore, popular anger towards John and Tribonian, and by extension their appointee, the Emperor, had set the stage for the beginning of the riots. On that day, the 13th of January 532 AD, the great mob swarmed into the streets, beginning to burn the city to the ground. Over the subsequent 5 days, a huge portion of the city's great buildings were torched, including parts of the Imperial Palace itself, and, most significant of all, the soon-to-be reborn Church of Hagia Sophia. For days on end, it was pandemonium. One can imagine standing here in the Augustaion, gazing up at marvellous buildings constructed over the course of decades, falling to rubble over the course of hours. Yet, on the second day, the rage of the mob became more direct. They were now wishing for the immediate dismissal of the two unpopular politicians, John and Tribonian. Justinian, perhaps finally realising just how perilous his position was, gave in to the mob's demands, dismissing the two corrupt men from public office. Yet the mob did not die down, not in the slightest. They were still out for blood, and the very next day this was evident for all to see. The sentiment was clear. The Emperor himself must be eliminated, and a replacement must be found. So the next question is, who? Enter Flavius Hypatius, a former consul and nephew to the old Emperor Anastasius I. Now, Hypatius had recently been dismissed from the palace by Justinian, perhaps out of mindless paranoia, it's hard to say, but the mob caught wind of it immediately. Unfortunately for him, the mob chose him as the replacement. That day, the mob broke into his house and dragged him out to the Forum of Constantine, much to the lamentations of his wife, well aware they may be leading him to his death. Next, the 30,000-strong mob led their impromptu emperor up the Mese towards the great Hippodrome where he would be crowned, if only for show and nothing more. As the riot poured into the circus, they led him to the viewing box in the Hippodrome where Justinian would have normally sat, and crowned him there and then, apparently with a gold necklace belonging to some random person in the mob. Hypatius, having very little choice in the matter, one can assume, accepted the necklace, thereby assuming his new role, the Emperor of the Romans. One can imagine the roar of the crowd upon his acceptance, 30,000 cries cradled by the great stadium, and at this point we get a fascinating narrative from within the palace itself, where Justinian, his wife, the Empress Theodora, and a number of the city's senators were hiding away from the mob's fury. Justinian and many of his supporters apparently heavily considered fleeing the city entirely, leaving the coup d'etat successful. He would lose his role, but hopefully not his life. The Empress Theodora, on the other hand, would not be bested so easily, proceeding to give one of the greatest speeches in all of Roman history, which concludes as follows. May I never be separated from this purple, and may I not live that day on which those who meet me shall not address me as mistress. If now it is your wish to save yourself, O Emperor, there is no difficulty, for we have much money, and there is the sea, here are the boats. However, consider whether it will come about you after you have been saved, that you would gladly exchange that safety for death. For as myself, I approve a certain ancient saying that purple is the finest burial shroud. The power of this speech is said to have swayed the room, including her husband. Just like that, Justinian had changed his mind. He would no longer flee. But by now, it was clear. Mere words would not exhaust the mob in the slightest. Only one option remained. Justinian called upon his two most senior generals, both of which had recently returned to the capital. Flavius Belisarius from his exploits against Persia in the east, and Mundus from Illyria. If anyone could stop the riot through force of arms, they could. By this point, it must have been decided for good. A bloodbath would ensue. Interestingly, the Chronicle of Theophanes also mentions a certain Narses, the famous general who would go on to play centre stage in the Gothic War, alongside Belisarius, who had apparently been tasked to bribe some of the mob to effectively shut up, though this can't have been very effective. And so, Belisarius, Mundus, Narses, and an uncertain number of troops entered the Hippodrome before the rioters, swords in hand, bows firmly strung, and at that point, the annihilation of the mob began. As time went on, hundreds of bodies began to pile high. Hundreds became thousands, thousands became tens of thousands. It was an indiscriminate slaughter on an almost unprecedented level. The blood of the dead seeping into the Hippodrome sand, their panicked footprints leaving a stencil, tracing the horrors of the day's massacre. During this melee, the pretend Emperor Hypatius was captured alongside his brother Pompeius. Perhaps unsurprisingly, Justinian later ordered them executed, their bodies thrown into the deep sea. It's at this point we must consider Hypatius. He was expelled out of the palace, probably due to Justinian's mindless paranoia. He was ripped away from his wife and family by the mob, and forced to play pretend emperor, eventually being executed without so much as a burial. Man, bad week all around. Now, sources disagree on exactly how many were killed on the day of the massacre, the day the Nika Riots came to an end. Procopius puts it at 30,000 dead, John Malalas at 35,000. Yet, in any case, in what must have been just a few hours, around 6% of the entire city, the largest city in Christendom, if not the entire world, lay dead at Justinian's feet. The message was clear: nobody would dare oppose him again. In the aftermath, a few notable things happened. Most prominently, the church of Hagia Sophia, burnt to the ground by the riots, was entirely rebuilt, leaving the building that still stands today, minus the Ottoman minarets added 1,000 years later. In addition, the two despised politicians, John the Cappadocian and Tribonian, were brought back into office by Justinian. After all those who complained were now dead, and all those who would complain were too scared. Unsurprisingly, it would be a while before the city would recover, before games in the Hippodrome would resume amidst the fear of the populace. Yet in time, they did, and normality resumed once again. As a final thought, Justinian's actions on that day were truly those of a tyrant, sheer desperation to cling onto power, and in this regard, it's unclear as to how politically justified he was in his actions. After all, to his mind, it was either him or them. In this, I don't doubt for a second that other emperors would have inflicted similarly despicable atrocities if they were in Justinian's shoes. Even famously virtuous emperors like Marcus Aurelius or John Comnenos probably would have bloodied their hand at least somewhat if they were backed into such a dark corner. But then again, Justinian had walked himself right into that corner. Justinian was negligent to have created such dire preconditions to have incited such a popular uprising in the first place. He was naive to have so easily lost the shape of his flock. But I digress. Commenting on the morality of ancient figures is a futile endeavour reserved solely for edgy teens on Reddit. Yet the Nika Riots undeniably remain a dark scar on his reign. That much, I'd say, is clear. Thank you for watching.